So this week's presenter is Jessica Leonora Whitehead, if I pronounce right.
That's fine.
Okay, so we'll call it Jessica from this moment, and she's a PhD student in the Communication and Culture program at York University. Jessica has recently won a Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship for doctoral work and has presented at various academic conferences, including the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, Canadian Association of Cultural Studies, Film Studies Association of Canada, and Canadian Association of Popular Culture. So we will listen to your amazing presentation.
I don't know if it's going to be amazing, but hi everyone. So yes, I'm Jessica Whitehead, and actually my area of work is in Canadian cinema, and I focus on early cinema in Canada. But I do have a great interest in Russian history, and I have done some work on the representations and mythologies of Russia in Western popular culture. And luckily enough for me, Sokurov, that is what Sokurov focuses Russian Ark on, are these mythologies. So Sokurov in this film is exploring how Russians perceive themselves and how the West perceives Russia. But today, as we went around the room, I thought it was really interesting. There were various different opinions about the film. And what I wanted to focus on was not necessarily so much on, because the film, everyone that watches it will have a different interpretation. So I wanted to focus on how this film fits in with Russian cinema. Because many people have said that this is an anomaly in Russian cinema because it is completely different from every other film. So I want to put this film into context and actually show that there is a dialogue going on with the larger Russian cinema. And as some of you mentioned, the stark absence in this film of the Soviet era is actually present in the underlying aesthetics and style of the film. It's largely a conversation with the Soviet era of film. So I want to have a conversation on the different forms of film during the Soviet era and how these influenced Russian art, specifically the influence of montage or early art films and Soviet realism. So I want to start today by talking about how film came to Russia. So Tsar Nicholas II was fascinated by the new medium in film, and he brought it to Russia in 1896 with the Lumiere brothers, who were invited to Russia to shoot the very first film, and this was of the Tsar's coronation. Nicholas was particularly interested in the propaganda elements of film and even appointed a court cinematographer who shot numerous home movies of the Tsar and his family, which actually can still be found today on YouTube. Historian Wendy Slater, in her book, The Many Deaths of Tsar Nicholas II, Relics, Remains, and the Romanovs, states that he was actually the first monarch to recognize film as a propaganda piece, and he carefully constructed images showing his family as the ideal middle-class family. So the universal picture of the Tsar, which is actually present in Russian art, which I'll talk about in a minute, is of the family together with Alexandra, the Tsar Nicholas, his 9-year-old son Alexei sitting on the floor, and the 4 beautiful daughters, very angelic, like in the film, dressed in white. This and many others pictures are constantly reproducing both Russian and Western films. And again, the family is seen in a very idealized fashion, very similar to how Tsar Nicholas actually presented himself. Wendy Slater goes on to argue that the constant representations of the family in popular culture is because we do not want the romance of the Romanov story to end. So, the Romanovs are very present throughout the film. The ball that is happening, so when you see the guests coming in at the first scene, they're actually going to the Tsar's ball. And so we're following through, so it's bookended by the Tsar. It starts with the guests going into getting ready for his ball, and then at the end of the film is that very much that imperial ball, and you can hear them saying, you know, this is the end. The diplomat says, the ambassador, sorry, says that he'll leave him there because, of course, this is when the imperial era of Russia ends. So Sokurov focuses on the obsession and so-called martyrdom of the Tsar and his family with his various images of the Romanovs throughout the film. The image of the family in the film, as you can see right here, is very reminiscent of the Tsar's own personal propaganda photos that he would display, as it shows the family dining together, very much like you would see a middle-class family. This does not necessarily look like the imperial family of Russia sitting there. So there's a duality, though, in the film, because while the Tsar is shown as this family man here, there is also the imperial ball and just the opulent background of the film. So these romantic imperial scenes are actually recognized in the film with the quote that Sokurov says, "Monarchies are not eternal, but we are free to dream away." This is very much reflective of the mythologies regarding Russia and the imperial era, which is largely the focus of the film. So I'd like to address a little bit what you were talking about, the imperial era. Now, of course, the Winter Garden Palace, which it was renamed the Hermitage, and it's a museum today, was an imperial palace. So its history is very much connected to the imperial era. But you are very correct to voice your criticism, because it's a very ubiquitous criticism of the film. Why is the Soviet era not shown? The only references of the Soviets are sort of dark, as in the scene where the museum directors are talking about their phones being bugged, or the scene of World War II where he says, you know, don't go in there, because obviously that was during the Soviet film. But Sokurov, I think, and has said, and other people defending Sokurov, says that, well, the reason he focuses on this imperial era is because that is what's connected to the museum. And I'd like to do it, and hopefully, as I get on through my talk, we'll see that even though the Soviet era is not portrayed, the Soviet cinema is the history of Soviet cinema is still very much sort of represented in the film. So in the piece that I sent along, I'm not sure if everyone got to see the email, by Chris Rivetto Biglioli, he mentions the omission of the Soviet era, and he says that this is in reference to the forced forgetting of various eras in Russian history. Firstly, of course, the Soviet era, there was forced forgetting of the Tsarist period, and of course, today there is a forced forgetting of the Soviet era under the Putin period. And of course, things have been renamed, which he mentions in his piece, St. Petersburg, for example, and the cities are renamed. The Hermitage Museum itself has been renamed many times. So he says that this is in reference to this forced forgetting. Well, I think this is a valid interpretation. The absence of the overt references to the Soviet era, there are still many hidden references, like I said, in the film, and I think that Sokurov is clearly influenced by his predecessors in Russian film. And I want to talk about this legacy of this amazing cinema, this amazing national cinema, in order to put some of these hidden references to light. So the early Soviet Soviet era was a burgeoning time for artists and filmmakers under Lenin, and this period after the revolution was called the New Economic Policy, and Russian historians will label this the NEP era. The NEP was in many ways a compromise of Bolshevik ideals in order to placate the many different factions. It was mostly represented by laws that sanctioned the coexistence of private and public sectors, which was state-oriented, a mixed economy. This era of compromise was far more open than what would occur in years later. The NEP also caused a rift in the Communist Party, as the left-wing members of the party, like Leon Trotsky, wanted all state to control all allocation of output, while conservative members like Stalin, I bet many people didn't think Stalin was conservative, but he actually was, advocated for a program that was more similar to state-run capitalism. The NEP compromise fell apart in 1928 with the adoption of Stalin's first 5-year plan. The most important legacy of the NEP era to Soviet film was the development of montage. So I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with concepts of Marxism and whatnot, but I want to get into how they influence montage. And people may have this knowledge already, but as there's probably people from many different academic backgrounds, I'd like to sort of just give a very bare bones summary. So in Capital, Mark writes that the central manifestation of his dialectic is class struggle as the most significant contradiction. So dialectics is what really influences Marxism, and contradiction is basically at the heart of what dialectic means. So he also identified other historically important contradictions. So contradictions is the key to all other categories and principles of dialectical development, according to Capital. So early Soviet thinkers were very interested in Marxist dialectics, including Lenin. And Lenin actually wrote that dialectics was the most important aspect of Western philosophy, and embraced the notion that contradiction was the root of understanding the world. So montage in film was developed as a response to dialectics, and it was a method to demonstrate this to the masses. So Lev Kuleshov started experiments with films and montage in the late 1910s to showcase his ideas on how film editing could elicit powerful emotion and demonstrate contradictions to the viewer that narrative alone could just never achieve. Kuleshov schooled an entire generation of Soviet directors, and one of his most famous students is Sergei Eisenstein, who I will be talking about a little bit later. Montage became an important tool for these directors to explore complex philosophical works and question societal norms. One of my favorite films created during the NEP era is Bed and Sofa. Bed and Sofa is an interesting example of the open and intellectual atmosphere of the NEP era, and was released in 1927 by director Abram Room. This film is particularly influenced by the Russian philosopher Alexander Kollontai, who wrote on the bondage of marriage. The film showcases the relationship of Ludmila and Kolya, and they are a typical middle-class couple, where because of Kolya's position as the breadwinner, he is a factory overseer, he is able to control Ludmila. Ludmila is shown as a prisoner in her home, forced to labor under her husband, just as he forces his laborers to work under him as supervisor. The film utilizes montage to demonstrate the similarities between the control Kolya has over Ludmila and his control over his workers. Ludmila's plight in life is changed with the arrival of Buldaya, who comes to live with the couple and represents the new Soviet man. Buldaya is a worker who assists Ludmila in her housework and frees her from her imprisonment in the home. There's yet another montage in the film that represents Buldaya in his position as a laborer and how that connects to his treatment of Ludmila. A particularly interesting element of the film is the fact that despite Volodya's representation as the new Soviet man, he does actually end up repressing Ludmila after they begin an affair and she becomes pregnant. This element of the film could possibly reflect that despite positive change of the new system, women were still often repressed. This film was not an ideal representation of the Soviet era, and Ludmila is actually at the end of the film is forced to have an abortion by both the repression of old Russia, Kolya, her husband, and the representation of the Soviet era, Buldaya. I wanted to show you a clip from the film. Here is the controversial abortion scene in the film, which demonstrates the plight of women has not changed much in the Soviet era. Ultimately, in the end of the film, Ludmila leaves the industrial city, which is in many ways representative of the workers' revolution, and she escapes to the countryside to raise her baby. So let's just watch a little bit of this. As you can see, Russian films, they love the music in the back, even though, I mean, some American silent films as well, but there's a particular, I think you can see sort of a similarity in some of the music with Russian art. Eventually, at the end of this clip, Ludmila, I won't show the whole thing, she leaves and, like I said, goes to the countryside. So films like Bed and Sofa were problematic for the Soviet government because in a country that not long ago had fought a bloody civil war, there had to be positive representations of the government and clear representations of what the Soviets stood for. And this film was not ideologically very clear. Under Stalin's centralization plan, the film industry was targeted in order to develop appropriate and educational films that would be beneficial for the regime. There was a shift in Soviet movie making in the 1930s with the appointment of Boris Shumyatsky as the new head of the newly centralized Soviet film organization, Soyuz Kino. Boris Shumyatsky stated his intention was to create a cinema for the millions. So during the NEP era, which I was speaking about a few minutes ago, foreign imports were allowed as a mechanism to build the film industry, because even though there was a film industry during the Tsarist period, it was very tiny, and there was not much of a Soviet film industry by the 1920s. So Shumyatsky realized that when he became the head of the Soviet Film Board, that there would have to be more done to appeal to the masses. He rejected the avant-garde films that were made in the 20s, and he particularly disliked the methods of Lev Kuleshov and condemned montage as being typically bourgeois, as it concentrated on form above content. The shift in Soviet filmmaking that led to the predominance of Boris Shumyatsky and his creation of the Cinema of Millions actually started at the Party Conference on Cinema held in 1928. There were differing opinions on how Soviet cinema should be shaped, both ideologically and commercially. The idea was promoted that cinema should be more traditional rather than avant-garde methods seen with montage. The result of the conference was the resolution that was written in December 9th, 1928. This resolution stated that the party had to have more control over cinema, and under Shumyatsky's rule, there was an adoption of a more accessible style in order to reinvigorate the film industry, as well as the use of films to further state propaganda, and this is called Soviet realism. The Soviet state under Stalin was very concerned with developing a state mythology, and we see that this was very present in most Soviet realism films. Circus is probably one of the best examples of Soviet realism, and I'm going to show you a brief clip about this film. This is really a very fascinating film. It's about an American actress who has a biracial son who is accepted in Russia. And in this scene that we're going to be watching right now, they are singing a song about the rights achieved of everyone under the Constitution of 1936. Oh, and sorry, just before we start, you can see that this is a very elaborate background, very different from the NEP era. This looks more like a big budget Hollywood.
What's the year of this?
This is in the 30s. This was in the late 30s, 1938. So the villain of the film is revealing that she has a biracial son, and she thinks that she's going to be, in the States she would have been killed. And she's fallen in love with this Russian. So she thinks she's out for it. They're saying like everyone is accepted in Russia. I'm going to start singing the song now. Okay, well, interestingly enough, too, just as an aside, the little boy in this film was actually an American boy. His father was an American military officer who was African American, and he married a Ukrainian woman. And he actually became very high up in the Russian military, and he stayed in Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union. So Sokurov's film, I believe, is an interesting bridge between the two eras of Soviet filmmaking, as the aesthetics of Russian Ark, with its elaborate dance scenes, its idealized images of Russian history, and its lack of montage, is more aligned in some ways with the Soviet realist era. But of course, it is still very psychologically complex, so you can see its roots also in the avant-garde, and it is an avant-garde film. So one of the most talked about aspects of Russian Ark is the fact that it was shot using a single sequence shot, which is actually in reference to the legacy of montage in Russian cinema, and Sokurov has said this. It's a long-standing it's a long-standing debate if he's deliberately trying to criticize the technique of montage or simply trying to have a dialogue with it. The latter seems to be more what his intentions were from his interviews, though he dislikes montage. So in his own words regarding the use of montage, he says, "I don't like montage, and this has nothing to do with the fact that I made Russian Ark, after which I came back to montage cinema. As you know, a film in one shot cannot be an absolute model. Such a model would not be correct, since the intellectual nature of cinema is based on literature, and literature is montage, a montage of words." So clearly he does agree with montage. This is just, he wanted to show the example of that not everything has to be a montage. So Sokurov has been quoted many times as well that he is very influenced by the work of Sergei Eisenstein, who actually worked under both the NEP era and the Stalin era of filmmaking. But he was very much influenced by the intellectual filmmaking of the NEP era, and as I said, he was Kulchov's student. Eisenstein's repeated use of complicated montage during the Stalin era actually made him one of the most famous Russian directors abroad, but often caused him problems at home from the government. While Eisenstein's early films were successful amongst the intelligentsia and were particularly popular, like I said, at the international level, his famous revolutionary film, The Battleship Potemkin, which you mentioned before we started, actually failed to attract a mass Soviet audience upon its release in 1925. The Battleship Potemkin demonstrates Eisenstein's use of montage to influence the populace, as this film is meant to elicit emotion with its editing techniques. The Battleship Potemkin also utilizes Marxist theories clearly, and the montage is basically a reflection of these Marxist ideologies. I was going to show a little clip from the very famous stair scene where he utilizes montage to help demonstrate the contradiction between the heroic sailors and Odessa citizens and the evil Tsarist army. And he uses a montage sequence here. So we'll take a look at that.
Another second because I just wanted to show the soldiers'
scenes, but it sort of gives you a little bit of an example because basically this is the most memorable scene, obviously, of the film, and I'm sure many people have already seen this, and you can see that there's the rhythmically intercut shots of troops marching down machine-like, juxtaposed with the shots of the innocent citizens being killed and wounded. And this is sort of a very clear demonstration of the ideology dialectics in film. So while the Battleship Potemkin was considered a great achievement in Soviet filmmaking, as early as 1926, there was already a debate within the industry whether to continue depicting revolutionary events or making films recreating traditional Russian culture. And in 1928, after the release of October, Eisenstein was attacked for restaging elements of the revolution, and there were also claims that he utilized decadent symbolism because of his use of montage. Eisenstein from then on, he had a very contentious relationship in Russia, and it culminated in 1936 when his film Benzin Lug was actually banned, and he was cited for being inartistic and politically bankrupt, and that he confused the class struggle with the struggle between good and evil. So he used religious symbolism in the film and in his montage sequence, and they were banned. The Eisenstein film that is most clearly referenced in Russian Ark is the 1920 October, which I just briefly spoke about. And this is a commemoration of the October Revolution. One of the most famous scenes of the film shows the storming of the Winter Garden Palace. And as Chris Rivetto, Biglioli, said, Sokurov actually reverses this frenzied scene. And the very interesting element of the Russian Ark film is that the scene where the Tsar is having breakfast is actually part of the storming of the Winter Garden Palace, because that's actually where they took the seat of the new government. So that's sort of a clear reference in Russian Ark. So I'm just going to show a couple of seconds, and then I'll just have a few concluding remarks, and then we can talk about it a little bit more. So this is the Winter Garden Palace, and they're storming it. And we're going in. We don't have to watch the whole scene because I don't want to make everyone sit here, but you can clearly, you can Google it and you can watch the whole clip. So some concluding words for my talk. Is that I really do believe that Russian Ark must be examined in the larger context of Russian cinema. Russian Ark is clearly a film created to showcase not only Russian history, but also its cinema. The use of montage in early Soviet cinema is clearly referenced in the film, and because there's only this single shot, which is, and Sokurov has said this is a reference to the use of montage in Soviet cinema. Montage was actually used as a mechanism to guide the audience to understand certain views, but of course was ultimately rejected as a propaganda tool, and some people have, and a few scholars have said that that's possibly why Sokurov chose not to use it, because then the viewer has total autonomy on what to believe in the film. And with the legacy of propaganda films in Russia. A very interesting aspect of Russian Ark is that it's a aesthetic connection to Soviet realism with its elaborate sets and the lack of montage. Russian Ark has many different interpreted meanings, and it was really interesting to hear what the audience had to say about what their meaning was, and if there is, I'm not sure if there's a discussion period after, but I'd like to sort of hear what people say in contest maybe to my speech. So thank you very much.
Thank you.